Okay, as we begin Unit 7, 1920s to 1939, Prosperity and Depression. This takes us through the 20s and the Great Depression. Now, once again, you could do, when you get to college, you will do an entire semester, if you take a history course, just on the 1920s, or just on some of the causes of the Great Depression, or just on the New Deal. So, doing a review here of this, and frankly, even doing it in a few days in your history course is really short. So I'm going to zip through this, just hit some highlights, and hopefully this will all be reminder to you. But I urge you to look at the other video lectures that are specific to, for instance, the Great Depression, and take the time to go through them on your own. All right, here we go. So, 1920, we're beginning right after the First World War. And, according to the Regents, 20s and 30s were a time of cultural and economic changes in the nation. That's sure true. During this period, the nation faced significant domestic challenges, including the Great Depression. That was about the biggest of the domestic challenges we had. 1920s was a time of cultural change, characterized by clashes between modern and traditional values. So, for instance, we talk about the Roaring Twenties, as they were known, the 1920s. When America emerges from the First World War, now it was a pretty horrific event and a pretty horrific time. And I should point out this is the era, I'll put this in here, of the lost generation. Great Gatsby. Many of you guys read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you read The Great Gatsby, it certainly captures that spirit of the Roaring Twenties. Party time, cutting loose, and everybody rethinking their values as a result of the war. Let's focus for a minute, since we have to focus on something, a bit on women. Women in the 20s really undergo their own sort of first revolution. We talk about women's rights revolutions. We usually talk about the 20s and the 60s. So this is kind of the first one. So what's going on with women? Well, first of all, the 19th Amendment gives them the right to vote. 1919 it's passed, 1920 it goes into effect. That's the first election women can vote in. Women had been voting before this in many areas of the country. Individual states had given them the right, but the 19th Amendment means they can vote across the country in elections. Began to give them a real political voice and real political independence from father, husband, son, brother. Prior to this, a woman, as we've talked about before, was defined by her relationship to a man. She was somebody's son. Somebody was her son, so she was a mom, or she was a wife to someone, or a daughter of someone. That was how she was thought of. And legally, to a great degree, that's how she was treated in the law. But if she can vote on her own, make political choices on her own, she becomes more culturally independent. And politicians have to start thinking about appealing to the women's vote. Women also had some money, a kind of economic independence. That experience from World War I, where they're working in the factories and have their own jobs, means they have money in their pocket. They get to decide how they spend that money. And that makes them an economic force. Marketers have to start appealing to women, advertising to women, products, consumer products, makeups and perfumes, but also kitchen gadgets that save them work at home, taking care of the family, all become marketed at women. And that economic independence empowers them to make their own choices. Women begin to express themselves differently. This is the age of the flapper. Smoking cigarettes, which was unheard of before World War I. Women didn't smoke in public. Drinking, dating, without necessarily looking for a husband. So they're dating just for a fun time, not just husband shopping. The movies are the big means of communication here. They're still silent movies, but they're creating fashion trends. Prosperity is enabling women to use leisure time for entertainment and extra money for luxury goods. So it's a time when they are assertive, flirtatious. There's a kind of you get very psychological with this, a kind of romantic power they have. They don't wait for the man to just woo them. They go out looking for a guy they want to snare and have a relationship with. So let's just look at this for a minute. This is just before 1919. These are women obviously campaigning for the right to vote, the public votes that were being held in some of the states on giving women the right to vote. Long Branch, New Jersey, this is a big summer resort at the time. And this is a booth that they had, votes for women, and these are suffragettes, as they were sometimes called, suffragists, they preferred, campaigning. So we take a look at these women who are campaigning to vote. Now take a look at this. That is a flapper. That's a photo from the time and typical of the whole thing. There's the high heels, the stockings now, the more revealing and sort of form-fitting dress. They are trying to show off, their sexiness. Smoking. They smoked cigarettes. One of the things that was common at the time, because cigarettes were truly just raw tobacco, no filters or anything, they had these cigarette holders. So you stuck the cigarette sort of in the end of this tube, and it filtered a little bit and cooled the smoke and made it less unpleasant and considered more elegant in a way. The short hair, it was called a bobbed hairstyle. And it's all about women sort of asserting themselves. This is the look. Off the shoulders, low cut, form-fitting, that short hairdo, and that's the fashion, and it's a much more aggressive, if you will, fashion in the day. This is, you wouldn't recognize her, this is Clara Belle. Clara Belle was referred to as the It Girl. She was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, and women patterned themselves on her. They, when she showed up in a movie, they wanted her dress, they wanted her latest hairstyle. She went through a bunch of them, and the character she played was often what was known as a vamp. Vamps were aggressive women who knew what they wanted, and they pursued the men. The men didn't pursue them. So she was sort of, a lot of women looked to her as a kind of model or ideal. But older people, older women, or the adults, saw this as a big threat. This was a big change in culture. Speaking of changes in culture, this is also the era of, and it fits with all this, Prohibition. So at exactly the same time that women got the vote, it just happened at the same time the 18th Amendment went in. Women's vote is the 19th Amendment, which was Prohibition. You sometimes see it referred to as the Volstead Act. You may see that. Technically, the Volstead Act was a separate law that sort of implemented Prohibition, but the same thing. 18th Amendment, Volstead Act, the same thing. Prohibition, of course, shut down the alcohol industry. It had a very strong anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic edge to it. After all, who drank? And I don't mean getting slosh drunk. As part of their culture, as part of their food. It was Italians, Germans. Italians drank their wine, Germans drank their beer. Irish immigrants drank beer, sometimes Irish whiskey. Jewish people um, drink wine as part of their weekly Sabbath meal. The Saturday night meal, and certainly on special holidays like the Seder at Passover, part of the meal, you say a special blessing over the wine that everybody shares at the meal. So this was just sort of part of life. Eastern Europeans, Polish and Ukrainians also have a great beer brewing tradition. And many of those people are Catholic, some are Jewish, but and they were known as the Wets. If you drank, you were one of the Wets. The Dries were Protestant nativists, anti-immigrants, those immigrants that are ruling the country and bringing their strange foreign ways. So Prohibition was, as we've talked about in the past, had to do with reforming society, the drug addiction of its day, but there was also another edge to it, and it was this anti-immigrant, anti-them edge. Okay, Prohibition goes in, but Americans still want a drink. It wasn't just the immigrants that wanted a beer or wanted a whiskey after work. So the Dries had gotten the law passed, but Americans routinely ignored the law and found ways around it. As a result, as you know, Prohibition backfires. Illegal booze makes drinking naughty, so attractive and glamorous. You make something illegal and then, people, particularly young people, teenagers and kids in their 20s, they want to defy the old folks and go off and drink. So you get the speakeasies, which are the semi-secret clubs of the day. In fact, everybody kind of knew where they were in town, but you could sort of pretend it was very secret and underground. Organized crime gangs grow unbelievably rich, supplying fake booze or imported alcohol. So if you went into one of these speakeasies, the speakeasies bought their alcohol from a local gang. Gangs fought over territory and fought in open, violent ways. The Tommy gun, Thompson submachine gun, if you see in the old movies, was actually a World War I battlefield weapon that they adapt to their gang wars, and the Tommy gun becomes a symbol of that. I'll just throw that in case you care. So they fought violently over territory. They would, if a bar was buying from the wrong guy, they'd burn it down or bust up the place or kill people. It really did get that bad. If you went into a speakeasy as a customer, though, they left you alone, right? The gangs went after the speakeasy owners if they weren't buying from the right guy. But the customers, they left alone. But what were the customers drinking? A glass full of formaldehyde, which is what you use to embalm bodies. A glass full of wood alcohol. So you may remember from chemistry, there's ethanol and methanol. Ethanol is what you drink. That's the alcohol in like wine and stuff. Methanol is wood alcohol. It will blow out your kidneys and make you blind. So there were a lot of kids, young people, who were getting literally brain damage, kidney damage, dying from poisoning from the fake booze. Or they were importing it down from Canada. They would ship it in on these super fast boats to get around the harbor patrols. They would secretly truck it in through the woods from Canada, this sort of business, and made huge amounts of money. It made organized crime a permanent part of American life. They got so rich from Prohibition, it funded them when Prohibition ended to then start taking over other industries. Local police were often on the take, were often corrupted. Um, as with drug gangs today, they are going to, the drug gangs are going to try to buy local authorities. You may know that in places like Mexico and South America, very often the local cops are being paid off by the drug dealers. And the average person was routinely breaking the law. Well, ignoring of the law brings all law into contempt. So the more people just ignore the law, the more they start getting reckless about everything and just look down on the whole system. It also backfires financially. U.S. government had been depending on those alcohol tax, whiskey tax revenues. Alcohol is made from grain. Beer is made from barley. So now suddenly the farmers, they don't know what to do with the stuff they have. They're continuing to produce grain, but they've got no place to sell it. Eventually, Prohibition will be ended by the 21st Amendment. We passed the 18th Amendment to make booze illegal, and then we have to pass another amendment to revoke it. In 1932, in the Great Depression, when the government starts to figure out maybe it would help business if farmers had a place to sell and we were getting some tax money, and the slogan was, America needs a drink. People are suffering so badly, why don't we just let them have a beer after work? And so in 1932, it is repealed. Let's look at a couple of things here. So speakeasies in cities were often quite glamorous places. They were places with jazz entertainment. They had nice restaurants attached to them. They were secret. You had to know, which door to go do the secret knock on. But a lot of the speakeasies were kind of cruddy places. In small towns and in suburbs, they were often, in back rooms of grocery stores and stuff. And yet, you see, this is a speakeasy. Here's a typical flapper of the day. Here's a couple of guys with their dates, right? Because if you were to go to these places, you wanted to, you wanted to bring some entertainment with you. You can see, you might be able to see the license plate here is Maryland and District of Columbia. And in those days, if you were driving different places, you needed different license plates. So it's down around D.C. or Maryland someplace. And you see, sign of the Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat was actually a cartoon character of the day, the Crazy Cat cartoon. Crazy Cat and Ignatz the Mouse. I hadn't even noticed that before, but it's plain, right? Like it's secret, but it's not. It's obvious what it is. This is one of my favorite things of the, that's not my hand there, this is an internet picture. It's one of my favorite things of the Prohibition era. This is called a wine brick or a grape brick. So all these businesses tried to find ways around Prohibition. So one thing they sold was a grape brick. You took a bunch of grapes, squeezed them, dehydrated them, squeezed all the water out of them, and packed them into like this solid block, and they sold the block. What are you going to do with that? Each brick dissolved in a gallon of water produces 1 gallon of unfermented non-alcoholic punch or juice. To prevent fermentation, add 10% benzoate of soda. In other words, we're sending you these bricks, grapes of port, sherry, rind, burgundy flavor. Those are all different styles of grape, different varieties of grape. And they're telling you, oh, well, you can take this and put it in a bucket of water and dissolve it, and it produces grape juice. But be careful, don't let it turn into wine, because if you leave it too long, it will. You had labels like this. After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days because then it would turn into wine. So they're telling you, if not consumed soon, this grape juice will, of course, ferment, and to prevent fermentation, benzoate soda may be added, juice may be kept in the refrigerator. So we're selling you this grape juice. Please don't leave it in the cupboard where it might turn into wine. So it was all this kind of clever nonsense here. Okay, well, the 20s had a lot of fun going on in it and a lot of silliness, a lot of bad things. The rise of organized crime turned out to be a permanent, very dangerous thing. Another thing that happens in the 20s, we spoke about this in one of the earlier lectures, is a really pretty harsh anti-immigrant attitude. Remember, during the First World War, the Russian Revolution had taken place, and Russia had been taken over by communists. Now, around 1900, you had communists kicking around, but they were a fringy group of weird political activists, and nobody thought that would ever actually catch on. Now they actually owned a country, and you started to see other revolutions in other places. There were communist and socialist uprisings in Germany and in Greece and some of these other places. And people began to say, my God, these people could actually take over. Even in the United States, you had a few isolated, violent incidents. For instance, somebody, unknown to this day, parked a wagon on Wall Street right outside of J.P. Morgan's bank. Remember J.P. Morgan? He was dead by this time, but the bank still existed. Anyway, while he was still alive, they parked, this is early 1900s, they parked this wagon in front of his bank, packed with explosives, and blew it up. If you go to Wall Street today, the corner of Wall and Broad, you can still see in several of the buildings the sort of pockmarks from the explosive. They packed it with like bits of metal and screws and nails and stuff, and it pocked up some of the buildings. You can still see the holes. Killed a few people. You had a few incidents like that. That led Americans to fear the, quote, Red Menace. This was the Red Scare of the 20s. That there were communists and anarchists all around us. The targets in the 20s were Eastern Europeans and Italians. There was a revolutionary movement in Italy. You did have some socialists there. They did get pretty strident. Italy suffered greatly from having almost a feudal system. We've talked about the sharecropping system. Italy functioned almost on a sharecropping system. And you did have some people who were pretty angry about it. Some of the communist revolutionaries in these European countries were from various Eastern European nations. And so they had Russian last names or Bulgarian last names. So, of course, people presumed all Italians, all Eastern Europeans are potential anarchists. The Palmer raids, I mentioned in the previous lecture, was Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who would go out and just round up immigrants, particularly Italian and Eastern Europeans, on the strength of the slightest suspicion or accusation and deport them. You had an outfit called the American Protective Association, which was just a group of nativists. They were out to, the only good American is one truly born here and whose father was born here and great-grandfather was born here and not these people. They managed to get passed in the 1920s a number of laws, the most well-known of which are the Quota Act and the National Origins Act. Thing to remember about it is that they almost completely shut down immigration to the U.S. especially by, quote, Southern and Eastern Europeans, meaning Italians and Greeks in the South, and Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, Slovenian, like that from the East. Also in the 1920s, we have to mention the revival of the Klan. Okay. The Ku Klux Klan, we remember, was created just after the Civil War by a group of veterans, Civil War officers, as a way to intimidate blacks in the South right after the Civil War to prevent them from using their new freedoms. By the 1880s, 1890s, the Klan it still kind of existed, but it was largely dead because the government was doing the job for them. Jim Crow was keeping blacks in their place. By the 1920s, that's beginning to change. Blacks are beginning to move into middle-class neighborhoods in northern cities, into factory jobs, and so on. We remember Booker T. Washington. I'll put this in. W.B. Du Bois, the NAACP, Tuskegee Institute, etc. You should know all of that from previous lectures. If you don't, go back over this material in your book. So African Americans were beginning to really assert themselves. Tuskegee Institute, they were getting education, and the other traditionally black colleges, so things like Howard University and Fisk University. The NAACP was standing up for their civil rights and suing. W.B. Du Bois was the great thinker of the day. Booker T. Washington had founded the Tuskegee Institute. Well, whites are beginning to panic. They see blacks as a threat, not just in the South, but now in northern cities. They start to look around and say, these people are moving in. They're changing the neighborhood. They're taking jobs. And the Klan revives, partially, I say, as a business. So part of the Klan thing was they recruited people. They went out looking for guys who were, disgruntled at work and not happy about it. And they talk you into, oh, well, why don't you come join me? I've got this club. And they would get the guys to start paying dues. And the dues would go to central offices. So it was a big kind of money-making operation for some people. It was partially for politics. Indiana, the state of Indiana, which had fought on the northern side in the Civil War, the Klan becomes the most powerful group in politics in Indiana for a period of time. They get a governor elected there. Why? Well, Indiana has a lot of working class areas. Indianapolis, for instance, which is the sort of main city in Indiana, and there are a number of other industrial locations. You're starting to get blacks moving in. Here in New York, I should point out the new Klan has a hatred for blacks, always, of course. But they also hate immigrants. And they look at Jews and Catholics as not real Americans. Anyone who was not a white Protestant native-born American didn't count, So they hated Catholics too. In 1928, Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, runs for president. He's unsuccessful. Al Smith is an Irish Catholic from New York City. There is a Klan parade in Queens protesting him openly. The Klan marched down the street in Queens. And actually one of the people who was at that rally, was Fred Trump, who was Donald Trump's father. So it was a very middle-class, mainstream kind of thing. And people, a lot of people just sort of went along with it. Part of it was out of nostalgia. By the 1920s, you think about it, you're about 60 years, excuse me, after the Civil War. Most of the Confederate veterans had died, but you still had a fair number around. You had a lot of guys who had served in the Civil War as teenage soldiers, and so in the 1920s you still had a bunch of them around, but they're dying off. And the younger generation, their grandsons, have this nostalgia for a time they never lived through. And so this new generation starts building a rash of monuments. You know, there's a lot of controversy now about whether we should keep the Confederate monuments that are around. Most of the Confederate monuments, the statues and things they're talking about, were not built in the 1860s or 1870s. The vast majority of them were built around 1920 in this sort of nostalgia movement. I point out one of the things that actually played a role, you don't want to make too much of it, but it did play a very significant role, was Birth of a Nation. Movies were in their infancy, and a director named D.W. Griffith was probably the greatest director of the time of movies. He was one of the first real artists with film, and makes some of the first real feature films. So silent films before D.W. Griffith were short. They were like a few minutes long, maybe 10 minutes long. It was called a one-reeler. And they were little skits or sight gags. D.W. Griffith starts to make what you would recognize as epic films. One of them that he makes is called Birth of a Nation. And it's based on this novel called The Klansman, and that should be singular, let me just fix it, which was written by Reverend Thomas Dixon. He was a Protestant minister who was born and raised in the South, and who lived, on Staten Island. That's a true story. And anyway, Dixon writes this novel called The Klansman. And the whole novel is set in the Civil War and just after. It's about a grand old Southern plantation family, how the Civil War ruins them. The son fights in the war, comes back home to find these depicted almost like ape-like animals, black soldiers in Union uniforms who are just tearing up the town. And the huge climax of the film, and this was a big dramatic moment in the theater, was when the Klan rides on horseback with torches, galloping to the music of the Ride of the Valkyries, if you know what that is, this heroic music. And as the women of the town are about to suffer under the hands of these black northern soldiers, a big dramatic bursting in of the Klan on horseback, who come in and beat the hell out of them and save the day and save the town, and it's a big heroic moment. Black audiences in the North were absolutely appalled, and there were protests against the showing of that movie, but nobody listened. It became a popular movie across the country, and it was so powerful that it really was the beginning spark of what started the revival of the Klan. True story. The FBI finally, the new FBI, was brand new in the 20s, began to investigate the Klan a bit. And mostly they went after the Klan for financial scandals. They figured out that there were guys skimming off the top and things. And the Klan lost a lot of its power by the 1930s, but it stuck around pretty strong through the 1960s as a significant force, and it still exists today, sadly. Okay, next topic. Well, I'll just show you this here. If you think I'm making too much of this, or how powerful they got for a brief time, look at some of these images. This is an open, in-the-street, daytime Klan parade. None of these people are hiding their faces. And if you notice these people, they're all women. This was like the women's auxiliary, the women's unit of of the Klan marching there. America first, one God, one country, one flag. That means everybody Protestant, no immigrants, and of course, obviously, no black. This is a Klan parade. You notice the Capitol in the background. This is part of a parade that was in the 1920s, was famous, that had thousands of Klansmen showing up in their robes, marching in Washington, D.C. itself with no trouble. This is the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, you can see there. A parade float with a Statue of Liberty, ironically, on it. This is a Klan, I think this was a wedding ceremony. Yes, it is, the Klan wedding ceremony. I know I got it for a reason. So they actually held things like weddings. And notice the kids are part of this too. This is that Klan parade in Washington, D.C. There's the Capitol in the background. This is just a small part of it, but you can see it's open and how huge this is. That's part of that same parade. On the steps of the Capitol building, there they are, with an American flag. There you go, all around here. Again, this is another Klan event, different time. And you notice it's even the little kids that they bring along to be part of this nonsense. The fiery cross, you may have heard about these things, seen it. This business of burning the cross as part of their ceremonies, this is a 1920s thing. The original Klan, I'm not defending the original Klan was just as disgusting, but it's interesting. This was not part of those original ceremonies. This was all invented in the 50s as part of the hoo-ha that went with this. Okay. Next, let's talk about the Scopes trial, also in the 1920s. Be careful about this one because most kids misunderstand it. Here we go. Tennessee passed a law making it illegal to teach anything in high school, particularly in high school science classes, which were the most relevant, that contradicts the Bible. What they're really talking about is evolution, Darwinism. Can't teach that man is descended from lower animals, any of that Darwin stuff. Okay, so the Scopes case is this. John Scopes was a high school teacher. I guess I should put in Dayton, Tennessee, because that comes up later. The town was Dayton. He teaches a class on evolution. I'll talk about that later, but just accept that for now. He teaches a class on evolution to his high school class, knowing he's going to get arrested. It's really a setup. He is setting it up. Everybody knows it's going to happen so that he can challenge the law, was the point of this. So he's arrested and he is tried. The Scopes trial is referred to as, sometimes, the trial of the century. The lawyers are famous. Clarence Darrow was the most famous public atheist lawyer of the day. And he defends Scopes. And in doing so is claiming to defend science. William Jennings Bryan shows up in town. You remember William Jennings Bryan? He goes back to the 1880s. But he shows up in the 1920s. He's still around. He's an old man, but he's still around. He's one of the old populists. Remember the farmers? He ran as a candidate for president, and he was a progressive reformer of that progressivist era. He shows up as the guest prosecutor. He volunteers to prosecute Scopes so that he can defend the Bible. Now, you sometimes get this in like cartoon version. Brilliant scientist versus stupid old religious guy. Understand what's really going on here. Brian's side of this is, if we reject the Bible, if humans are just another animal, then what are human rights? Why treat workers more justly? Why demand charity and promote care for the poor or the oppressed? Brian and old-fashioned religionists were afraid that with no Bible, society would no longer treat the human person as special or sacred. Are they right, I ask? Well, that's sort of how we get to Nazism and racism and things, yeah? So what they fear, social Darwinism. Life is mere survival of the fittest, no morals. And the weak should fall aside. That's what they're afraid teaching evolution will lead to. On the other hand, Clarence Darrow and his friends say, if we reject science, we live in a world of superstition. We deny the reality of geology and biology. We don't engage in the human act of questioning, of being curious, of being willing to follow the objective data. So you see, there actually are two sides to this question. Note, the trial was largely ballyhoo, which was a term at the time, sensationalistic. Scopes went along with it on principle, even though he may never have actually taught the lesson. There is some reason to believe he never actually did teach that lesson to the class. He just set it up to be arrested for it. He was actually found guilty at the trial because he had broken the law as written by Tennessee. But he was never actually fined because he was supposed to be fined, but there was a technicality of how the fine was done, so he never actually paid for it. The town, Dayton, Tennessee, played it up as much as they could, this whole big fight, really to promote tourism for the town. It became the town's major industry for a few weeks. But in fact, it represented a real cultural conflict between modernism and traditionalism. I also point out to you, this is a very important note for you Farrell men. The Bible religionists here were not Catholic. Too many guys somehow think the Catholic Church was in on this. They were not. They were Protestants. The Catholic Church has never had a problem with Darwin as biology. But social Darwinism as morality is evil. That's the Catholic Church's position. To us, the book of Genesis in the Bible is not a geology textbook. We accept it as poetry, meant to convey a truth. The 7 days of creation is a poetic way to emphasize that all human beings are made in God's image and likeness, that we carry sacredness in ourselves, that we are entitled to honor their humanity, entitled to honor for, I should say, their humanity as a reflection of God. We don't have a problem with God allowing the natural process of evolution to bring about different species. So this is never about Catholics. It's an important thing to note. Let's just take a look at these. Okay, so this is John T. Scopes. This is the man himself. This is the high school biology teacher about whom the trial was held. This is Clarence Darrow. This is William Jennings Bryan. The trial was held in the middle of summer. It was like 110 degrees in the courtroom, so they took off their ties and all this and tried to live through it. I should also point out, by the way, they seem kind of friendly. That's because they are. They were actually good friends. And they had fought together on a lot of progressivist causes. Both of them, back in the 1890s, 1900, 1910, had fought for government regulation of the meat industry, had fought for protection for workers, protection for farmers and stuff. So they were both progressives. But when it came to this issue of the teaching of evolution, Darrow said the way we progress as a society is by applying science, not superstition. Bryan said the way we progress as a society is by recognizing the sacredness of the human person, and social Darwinism is evil. And so they wound up in court together. This was part of, if you went to Dayton that summer, the whole place was turned into like as it was known, the monkey trial land. So they sold books, the Anti-Evolution League, William Jennings Bryan's books, Bibles, Hell in the High Schools, and so on. This was their fear. You start with Christianity, but you start to deny the Bible. Then man's not made in God's image. There's no miracles. There's no God. And before you know it, you're an atheist. This is the fear of where they're going. Some people, though, thought that the whole thing was really publicity. There's Dayton grinding on the organ, playing music. This was an old-fashioned organ grinder. And sending out a monkey, ha-ha, because it was the monkey trial about humans descended from monkeys, which is not what Darwin said, raking in the cash. Okay, next, 1920s, let's talk about African Americans. African Americans continued to struggle for social and economic equality while expanding their own thriving and unique culture. So, let's talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Absolutely know it, have heard of it. We talked a little about it in one of the previous lectures. I just remind you, as previously mentioned, we're talking about the result of the Great Migration. That's when African Americans moved up to the north during the World War I to work in all those factories and so on. The Harlem Renaissance is part of this. It's that burst of culture that takes place in these new black neighborhoods, most particularly in Harlem and New York City. That became kind of the center of this. So there was a book written called The New Negro, which was the word at the time, the polite word at the time, by Alan Locke, who was a black scholar, and it's sometimes called the Bible of the movement. If you're interested in the Harlem Renaissance, The New Negro by Alan Locke is kind of the catalog of all of the people involved with it. You've got a new middle class. There's prosperity, and with that prosperity comes culture. So, for instance, in dance, you had Josephine Baker and Bill Bojangles Robinson. Both of the, and by the way, I'm just picking a couple of names. You could have 100 names on these lists. I'm just giving you an example. Bill Bojangles Robinson was the great innovator of tap dance. Josephine Baker was, to put a word on it, modern dance. Some of the most famous white dancers in history, Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, largely based their work on people like Bill Robinson. In music, just to name a few, you had Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway. These were innovators in jazz who, for instance, George Gershwin, a Jewish son of immigrants composer, white guy, writes Rhapsody in Blue, which is the great American classical music piece. It is all based in black jazz, and he gets the ideas in the music, if you like, from guys like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. Later, rock and roll and modern music will come out of this. Writers, a lot of writers. Langston Hughes, a poet and playwright, County Cullen, another poet, Zora Neale Hurston, novelist, scholar. She wrote nonfiction books too. And Aaron Douglas, a muralist. So again, just to show you a few of these. These are a few of these folks. So, excuse me. That's Alan Locke, just so you see them, who wrote that basic book that's the catalog, if you like, of the Harlem Renaissance. A couple of these guys I'll just point out. There's W.B. Du Bois. His idea that blacks should engage in culture and engage in scholarship. He's not part of the Harlem Renaissance directly because he doesn't live there, but he certainly inspires it. Josephine Baker there, come back to her in a minute. There is Louis Armstrong, another one of the great jazz musicians, famous jazz trumpeter. Duke Ellington, the band leader. Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas. A lot of the Harlem Renaissance revolved around nightclubs. 1920s, not just speakeasies, but these nightclubs where you would have entertainment. You go in, you could get a little something to eat, you could get a drink, and then there were floor shows. There were comics, musical comics, there were bands, there were dancers, there were acrobats, and so places like the Small's Paradise, the Radium Club, probably the most important of all of them was the Cotton Club. It was the most famous nightclub around, and Cab Calloway was the house band there. The Savoy Ballroom, where they invented the Lindy Hop, one of the popular dances of the time, the Log Cabin. These were all part of the Harlem Renaissance. You can see how much activity there is there. That's Josephine Baker. She was, once again, she was a massively glamorous, extremely talented dancer, innovative dancer and entertainer in general. Became a real cultural icon through the 50s and 60s. And you can see she's also part of that 1920s flapper kind of thing, except really kind of souped up. This is an interesting item too, Macbeth. This is a theater in Harlem, and the reason I show you this is Orson Welles, who was a white guy and one of the greatest directors of movies and plays in American history, during the Harlem Renaissance, hires an all-black cast and does Macbeth with an all-black cast, unheard of before this, and sets it in Haiti instead of in Scotland. And Macbeth is the king trying to take over Haiti. So this is a Shakespearean play that he kind of reworks as a vehicle for black actors. This is kind of part of the thing of the Harlem Renaissance. Part of the Harlem Renaissance, too, is this character named Marcus Garvey, who's a completely different kind of fella. So, Garvey founded a thing called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was founded in Harlem. He ran it. And it advocated something a bit different, black separatism. His attitude was, if whites are going to treat us badly, if they're going to try to shut us out of things like the economy, fine, then we'll have our own economy. Since whites cut blacks out of business, we'll form our own. And he encouraged black-only neighborhoods with black-owned businesses of all types. He was actually friendly, this sounds bizarre, with the KKK, because they kind of agreed together that whites would have one society and blacks would have another, and as long as they didn't touch each other, get involved with each other, they could all kind of live side by side that way. He was also a pan-Africanist. Pan is actually a Greek word that means all, so an all-Africanist. He believed that all of the continent of Africa should be united as a single nation that was racially pure and bring back the black diaspora. Diaspora is another Greek word. It means the spreading out. So it goes back to the Jewish people, believe it or not. When the Romans destroyed the Jewish homeland, Judea, the Jewish people were scattered around the Roman Empire as refugees. That was known as the diaspora. Garvey talked about the black diaspora from Africa and encouraged people to return to Africa to rebuild it as a single nation. Of course, and this is Marcus Garvey, the goal was that he would be president of this new nation of Africa. He had a gigantic ego. He started his own shipping company, the Black Star Line. That's a play on words. One of the most famous companies of the time was the White Star Line. The Titanic belonged to the White Star Line of ships. So he starts the Black Star Line, which was the whole point of it was going to be the transport company to bring people back to Africa. Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association gave a huge boost to black pride and black self-reliance. But Marcus Garvey himself was something of a character. He never actually visited Africa himself. He spent a lot of time with titles and uniforms. He was born in Jamaica and moved to New York, but he never became a U.S. citizen. So he was arrested for fraud, for implying to investors that the Black Star Line actually had ships when it didn't, and wound up being deported. The UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, existed for years afterwards. It may still actually exist today, but it never had kind of the power it had when he was around. So you got to take a look a bit at this. Let me just start here real quick. Aaron Douglas, I mentioned, one of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. I just want to mention him for a minute before I go back to Marcus Garvey. I just wanted to show you this. Aaron Douglas is kind of most well known as an artist for his murals. And he developed a very distinctive style, really developed this style of mural as it looks here, with this sort of shadow figures and these bursts of color in circles. There you have the Capitol building, you have factories up here, and you have African Americans coming from the cotton fields looking up to this with their dance and their music. It's symbolic. He was very into this. And I think this is supposed to be W.B. Du Bois, and scholarship, the written word here, sort of this burst of sunlight. This is very, very much him. This is another one. This is a illustration he did, a sort of painting he did, which is, again, his distinctive style. He's got all kinds of symbolic figures in here. There's the log cabin. There is the smokestacks, I think that's supposed to be. The tropical thing where many of the African Americans in America came from, the tropics, Jamaica and Haiti and so on. And these folks engaged in dance and the arts. This is very, very Aaron Douglas. This is not. This is Marcus Garvey, wearing this kind of general's uniform. He declared himself a general of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, gave himself a medal, and drove around Harlem in this outfit on occasion. He had part of the UNIA was a uniformed group, and you see guys back here, but also women, and a disciplined, uniformed corps. They were not violent, by the way. This was not meant to be like they were not soldiers about to attack you or something. They were just a sort of drill team that he had working for him. This is a group of United Negro Improvement Association folks meeting at one of the churches. I think this is up in Harlem. There's a portrait of Marcus Garvey there. He gave himself university degrees, as one does, I guess. And this is the Black Star Line, the stock certificate that he sold. He was looking to raise money to fund this idea of his to Africa. You see up here, Africa, the land of opportunity. And so, you know, this was going to be help people move back to Africa. I'll just show you what he got in trouble for. This is what he got in trouble for. So this is an advertisement for the Black Star Line, trying to advertise the company. Looking for colored men. He wanted the engineers, the wireless operators, that's the radio operators, the shipmasters, that's the pilots and captains, to be, you know, he wanted like an all-black crew. And you have up here a picture of a ship, the SS Phyllis Wheatley. You may remember, if you paid very careful attention, way back, Phyllis Wheatley was a black slave around the time of the American Revolution who became famous as a poetess. She's the first published black author in America, and forgotten mostly by white society, but there's been interest revived in her recently by all scholars because she was an interesting poet. But he names this ship after her. Here's the problem. This ship doesn't exist. He put the photo on here, but he didn't actually have a ship. And so the government went after him for claiming it was fraudulent advertising. And they wound up then prosecuting him and deporting him. Okay. I'm going to leave this lecture here and pick up with part B in just a moment to pick up with Great Depression.